Okay. I'm Rosalie Paul. I'm a member of PeaceWorks. And PeaceWorks is an organization that's been active since 9/11/01, trying to broaden the awareness of our community and ourselves about the political and economic situation that we find ourselves in, and hoping to build the activist community with discussions and films and presentations of various kinds. We're really pleased tonight to have Bruce Gagnon and Richard Rhames sharing with us their learning about what's going on in Ukraine. They've been paying very, very close attention through many sources to the story there, and it's a privilege for us to be able to bring them to the community. And after their presentation, we're going to take a couple of questions at a time, maybe, and, well, really just that we're very grateful to have this church, the neighborhood UCC, in this wonderful space right downtown, right across from the military-industrial complex, as we see it, across the street. Not to mention Frosty's Donuts. So it's very exciting for us this is our first event here, and we're going to be passing the hat at some point to offer a little support for the church. So thank you very much for coming.
As Rosalie said, I'm Richard Rhames so far. Bruce asked me to come up and be part of this event, and I questioned him, but he insisted. So anyway, I'm here. I guess I'm going to do some kind of contextual stuff. Bruce has actually been following this stuff a lot more than I have, and plus it's our busy season. I'm pulling weeds and fixing tractors more than I'm paying attention to what's going on. But as I'm going to try to point out what's going on, the minutia changes a little from year to year or from month to month, but the game remains the same. As Chomsky said years ago, you're always told that the world and the international situation or the national situation are hopelessly complex. And as Chomsky pointed out, it actually works in a way that's very simple, and your average third grader could figure out how the world works if they were given the information, which, generally speaking, they're not and we're not. You have to look. It's work. I guess I noticed Bruce was kind enough to send me the digital flyer for this evening's presentation, and I guess, spoiler alert, right? Raises three questions. Was the U.S. involved in the 2014 Ukrainian coup d'etat? Yes. Is the U.S. involved in the Ukrainian civil war today? Yes. Could the Ukrainian crisis be a trigger for war between the U.S. and Russia? Yes.
Well,
I think.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Okay.
Please give him a hand.
All right. I came in under budget. Yeah. All right. Anyway, it's nice to be here this evening. I don't know how many folks noticed that General Wesley Clark, Michael Moore's favorite presidential candidate 10 or 15 years ago, was recently on MSNBC and announced that you know, the wrong kind of American citizens needed to be put in camps. As I say, these ideas come and go depending on how much pressure the government is feeling. During World War II, of course, there was internment of Japanese people. We don't need to go into what we did to the Native American population or black people or poor people. These ideas just kind of keep resurfacing. And the people who run things have power in their back pocket and the threat of force, violence. They can make your life very unpleasant. And it sounds like Mr. Clark is suggesting that maybe things are getting a little dicey right now for the people who are running things. I also noticed that, and maybe you did, there's been this, it was a little boomlet of PR. One of the London tabloids got a hold of a picture of the young Queen Elizabeth of England being shown. Daddy was showing her and Mom how to do the Heil Hitler salute. It's all in good fun. And the headline, Her Royal Highness, that was nice. What's interesting is that, as Chomsky and other people have pointed out, if you go back and read Deterring Democracy or some of these other books that are out there and look at the press of the day back in the 30s, it was pretty clear that the dominant interests in the United States actually favored the Nazi Party and Mussolini. I was telling Bruce one of my favorite quotes from the business press back in the day that was crying up the virtues of Mussolini was that basically the Italians, they're simple people and they enjoy being dramatically governed. You know, the wops are unwopping themselves was another headline. This is wonderful. Because Mussolini was good at making the trains run on time, snuffing out democracy, going after labor, which is our usual standard. We like foreign rulers, Pinochet. There's a long list. People who will go after progressive elements in society and kill people of principle in order to smooth the way for corporate predation. Jumping around a little bit here, but I think the last time I was on Bruce's show, it was around that we're going through this is the last year, I guess, of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And, of course, recent events in the South, well, blowing away black people here in this country. These issues that were supposedly put to rest are not really put to rest. Anyway, there's this great quote in this James Lewin. He wrote Lies My Teacher Told Me, which I stumbled onto years ago. This is a more recent book, The Confederate and Neo-Confederate Reader, which promises to be quite good. I haven't really gotten far into it. But back in the day when Lincoln was in politics and when people could actually sit still for hours worth of political discussion with no commercials, things actually got said. And Lincoln, I think probably the last good Republican president, he had this to say when he was debating Stephen Douglas for Congress in 1858. And I mentioned earlier about how I think things don't change much from period to period. It is the eternal struggle, said Lincoln, between two principles, right and wrong throughout the world. It is the same spirit that says, quote, you toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it, unquote. No matter in what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle. I would suggest that, the United States, beginning with the native population and its spread of empire to the west, back in the day when we invaded the Philippines, the Congress was unapologetic about using the term imperialism and so forth. We've neatened up the language. We don't talk like that anymore, but the policies remain the same. We seek to beggar the rest of the population to bring home the bacon to the United States. I suspect people have, excuse me, heard of this guy George Kennan, who was a Cold War architect. One of his planning documents from 1948, this is a fairly famous quote, I suspect many of you have heard it. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts, and the less we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. Well, of course, Kennan's straight power concepts are still very much in place, but for public relations purposes, and as we've increasingly become a cartoon nation and with a distracted population, we continue to kind of sugarcoat our various imperial exercises, slaughtering millions of people under the pretext of doing good and about human rights and spreading democracy and nation building. The game remains the same. You toil and make the bread, and I'll eat it, in Lincoln's construction. And I would suggest that that is very much what's going on globally as far as the United States is concerned. This matter with Ukraine, it's just the most recent attempted deconstruction of what was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a lot of petroleum resources. That's why Germany invaded. We want those. We have resorted to fracking in this country. Very costly, very environmentally damaging, but to keep the game going, we're willing to roll over, or the petroleum companies and the government are willing to roll over rural populations in order to do it. Whereas Russia has this stuff that's easily exploited and very profitable. The great game continues. It's worth noting, and I don't know how many people know this. I think I first read it in Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. Apparently, the University of Michigan has quite an archive of pictures and other evidence, it's called, about the polar bear expedition, which is right after, in the closing days of World War I, in order to try to put down the revolution in Russia. The United States invaded what was to become the Soviet Union. We sent 13,000 troops over there. It was kind of an international effort. The Greeks sent 24,000. And they sent them to Crimea and Ukraine, actually. We have had an interest in that landmass forever, well, since we became an imperial power. They have stuff that is profitable, and the people who run this country like to eat the fruits of other people's toil and other people's resources. And sugar-coated or not, that is the game. So clearly the United States, I believe, as part of this effort, was very much involved, and Bruce can talk about it. You remember the quote that went viral from Vicki Nuland, F the EU, because they wanted to be a little kinder, gentler. Germany had, and the rest of Europe was in a commercial relationship with Russia because of Russian petroleum interests. And they were not inclined to go and rock the boat. But the U.S. Geostrategic interest was to continue taking Russia apart and to get the resources. And that was what animated it. That's what continues to animate it, I believe. there really isn't a lot of time. But if you look, it's not hard to discover that even the things that are in the news recently, the situation in Greece, and the situation in Iran in this most recent treaty, these can easily all be tied back to Russia and the effort to squeeze Russia. Russia increasingly is pretty much a petrostate, and it has one main export, which is petroleum or natural gas. And part of the takedown effort is to destabilize that. And the events in Greece and Iran are part of that, I believe. And people who know a lot more about it than I do have been writing. If you do a little search, you'll find it. And it certainly fits in with this long-standing pattern that I've been talking about. And Bruce?
Thank you, Richard. Give him a hand. Go ahead. I took Richard to dinner before we started this evening, and I always ask him how his farming operation is, because I know it's a struggle for a small farmer to maintain a viable operation these days. And he told me he was out on his tractor in the dark last night, and then out there again today. So it's a tough job that he has, and I appreciate him coming today because I know he's dead tired. I've been daily following the Ukraine story since late 2013. And when I say daily, I'm talking 2, 3, 4 hours a day, watching videos, reading articles, everywhere I can find them. For some reason, similar to my efforts on Jeju Island, I've been absorbed and consumed by the story in Ukraine. And so when in early 2014, late 2013, early 2014, when the so-called revolution, or what they call Maidan, happened in Kiev, I was right on top of it. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who Richard referred to a minute ago. She's my favorite. She's married to the neocon Robert Kagan, who some of you might remember from the Project for a New American Century during the Bush administration. But anyway, Victoria Nuland bragged on a stage where on one side there was a banner from Chevron, and the other side there was a banner from ExxonMobil. And she bragged to the audience right before the Maidan happened that the United States had invested $5 billion to ensure a secure, prosperous, and democratic Ukraine, unquote. In fact, the CIA, USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and George Soros's money were what was behind this operation to topple the duly elected government inside of Ukraine. They funded NGOs to get them out on the street. They paid for people to be out there day and night. They funded neo-Nazi groups and others that violently forced this coup d'etat of the elected Yanukovych government. Nobody says that the Yanukovych government was clean. They were corrupt, but they were elected by the people of Ukraine. And if you truly believe in democracy, you wait another year until the election to remove this person and replace this person with someone better. But that's not what happened. It's now been proven that the Nazis during that time were shooting protesters and police, and Western media uniformly blamed this on the Yanukovych government that was eventually forced out. In fact, just this week, there have been more stories about further evidence that the Nazis were up on top of buildings shooting their own fellow protesters and policemen in order to create the international illusion that the Yanukovych government was killing people on the street during the Maidan. The bottom line is that the United States wanted regime change in Ukraine as a way to force Russia to invade, which would justify further NATO operations along the Russian border. When the Berlin Wall fell in the early 1990s, Mikhail Gorbachev, then the Soviet premier, was promised by the then Secretary of State, Jim Baker, that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward towards Russia. During the Clinton administration, NATO expansion was on steroids, heading for the Russian border. When George W. Bush was president, he withdrew from the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that disallowed deployments of so-called missile defense, key elements in U.S. first strike attack planning. Missile defense works like this. You fire a first strike attack at Russia or China, try to take out their nuclear weapons. When they fire their retaliatory capability, you use missile defense interceptors to take out their retaliatory strike, giving the U.S. a theoretical first strike attack. In fact, every year at the U.S. Space Command, the U.S. war games this very thing. I've read reports of it in industry publications like Aviation Week and Space Technology. The U.S. today is encircling both Russia and China with these missile defense systems that are being placed on ground-based launchers and on board Navy destroyers made here at Bath Iron Works. When Hitler invaded the Soviet Union during World War II, he, like Napoleon before him, swept into Russia through Ukraine. In Western Ukraine, the part of the country farthest away from the Russian border, the nationalist leader, Stefan Bandera, at the time, during World War II, put on a Nazi uniform. He was Ukrainian nationalist. He put on a Nazi uniform and joined forces with Hitler's attack on Jews, Poles, and Russians. Over 25 million people inside of the Soviet Union were killed as they eventually defeated Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union. And so thus today, the Russian people are hypersensitive to the Nazis, particularly the Nazis inside of Ukraine. Today, the Nazi battalions that are called Pravy Sector, which means right sector, carry the Bandera banner as they march through Kiev, and they proclaim their hatred for Russia and for anybody that speaks Russia, even Ukrainian citizens, their fellow citizens who live near the Russian border, who speak the Russian language. They call them Moskuls and Colorado beetles, and they say their job, these Nazis say their job is to squash the Colorado beetles. The U.S. is using the Nazis to create chaos inside of Ukraine, just the way we've done in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and other countries. The goal to destabilize Russia. After the successful Maidan in early 2014, the U.S. and Victoria Nuland began pushing their guys to run as the ones to run the new puppet government in Ukraine. The tape of Nuland, her voice caught on tape, went viral as she was saying, "F the EU." She said the United States wanted the guy called Yats, who's a central banker by the name of Arseny Yatsenuk. And indeed, he was made prime minister along with the heavy-drinking Petro Poroshenko as president of the new Ukraine. They call Poroshenko the chocolate king because he has a major chocolate operation that today still functions within Russia, bringing him a lot of profit, quite ironic, as he wants to destroy Russia while making money off his chocolate inside of Russia. One of the first things done after the Maidan, after the big revolution in Ukraine, was to outlaw the speaking of Russian in Ukraine. You're no longer allowed to speak Russian in Ukraine. And that meant if you lived on the eastern side of Ukraine, along the eastern border, nearest to the Russian border, where you had relatives just over the border in Russia, suddenly you were a bad person. You were evil. You were a Moscow, a Colorado beetle. The Russian language in Ukraine is the most common first language in the Donbass and Crimea regions. The Donbass being that eastern Ukraine region closest to the Russian border. And it's also the predominant language in large cities in the east and the south of the country. Attacks by right sector and other Nazi groups began against Russian-speaking citizens across the country. People in eastern and southern Ukraine began collecting signatures for a referendum on the rights of Russian-speaking citizens. They wanted more local powers, a federated government. They wanted to elect their own governors. Can you imagine that? Instead of having them appointed by the central government. In Odessa, on May 2nd, 2014, these people, who today are called separatists or rebels by the Western media, they set up tents and were collecting referendum signatures outside of the trades union hall in Odessa. They were attacked by swarms of Nazis who were carrying bats, baseball bats, steel rods, guns, and Molotov cocktails. The Nazis were bussed into Odessa from other cities in western Ukraine. The people that were collecting the cities, signatures, the people from Odessa, ran inside of the trades hall to protect themselves as their tents were destroyed, set on fire by the Nazis. Firebombs, Molotov cocktails were then thrown into the 5-story building, the trades hall, and it started to burn. The building started to burn. People came out onto the window ledges to escape the fires and the smoke inside the building, and they were shot at. There are YouTube videos that you can go online, just Google Odessa Trades Hall, and you see people shooting at them, these Nazis shooting at people as they were sitting on the ledges trying to get a breath of air. Some people actually jumped from the windows to save themselves as the fire raged. And when they hit the ground, many of them were beaten to death by the Nazis with their bats and steel rods. The fire department, only a block or so away, was blocked by the Nazi crowds, preventing them from getting to the fire. And it wasn't until hours later, when everything was said and done, that the fire department arrived. Police stood by and did virtually nothing. The Western media never told the truth about this event. But as I said, it's all on YouTube in great, gory detail. After that, people in eastern Ukraine began recognizing that they had to defend themselves from these right-wing attacks. Western media again amped up the claims that these people were Russian separatists, rebels, and that Russia had actually now invaded Ukraine, which was a lie. The U.S. accused Putin and Russia of invading, and today there still has not been one shred of evidence of any kind of Russian invasion. It is true that Russia did move troops to the border near Ukraine. That is true, actually, but they never, ever invaded. Russia has, though, supplied weapons to the self-defense forces so they might defend themselves. And frankly, if they hadn't, they would have been overrun by now. The Ukrainian army, run by the U.S. puppet regime in Kiev, is being armed, trained, and funded and directed by the United States and the CIA. In fact, inside of the SBU, the Security Services branch of the Ukrainian government, in their headquarters building in Kiev, the American flag flies over the building today, indicating that the U.S. is really running this entire operation. Alongside of the U.S. and the CIA, Canada and Britain are now also helping to fund and arm Kiev's army. The U.S. Army is now on a 9-month rotational mission in western Ukraine where they're training and arming Kiev's army. They've created a National Guard, something they never had before, and they brought in the Nazi volunteer battalions, as they're called, putting uniforms on them, and then training them, and then sending them back to the Eastern Front to kill civilians. Kiev has had 3 draft call-ups with thousands of young men refusing to serve in the U.S. puppet army of Ukraine. Thousands have left the country. Buses by the hundreds have been organized. People putting their children on, their young sons on these buses, sending them out of the country. And guess where most of them go? They go to Russia. They go to Russia. Russia has accepted thousands of these young men, as well as thousands of innocent refugees, civilians, men, women, and children, running from the shelling that they're being inundated with. Daily shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk, the cities in the Donbass, and small villages in the east near the Russian border still continue. Several thousand innocent people have been killed. Hospitals, schools, daycare centers, churches, apartment blocks, rail stations, airports, water systems are all being shelled. The U.S. is even providing drones to Kiev's army to help with the targeting of these civilian places. My understanding of international law is that this is a war crime because you're not allowed to kill innocent people. The Minsk II ceasefire under German and French direction called for Kiev to negotiate for local autonomy with Donbass. Der Spiegel, the German newspaper, or magazine rather, reported at the time that the U.S. was furious with Germany and France for initiating these Minsk II negotiations. The U.S. wants to make things so bad that Russia is forced to enter Ukraine to protect the people. NATO has been expanding right up to the Russian border into Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, and more. Missile defense has gone into Romania and Poland. Aegis warships, outfitted with these missile defense interceptors, are now on maneuvers in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Baltic Sea. And they will soon be sent to the Barents Sea and the Bering Sea, creating essentially an entire encirclement of Russia. Why this provocation of Russia? Russia has the world's largest supply of natural gas and significant supplies of oil. And by now we should know that the number one job of the U.S. Pentagon is to serve as the primary resource extraction service on behalf of corporate globalization. Due to climate change and the melting ice in the Arctic, the oil corporations can't wait to drill, baby, drill up there in the Arctic zone. Well, which country on this planet has the largest land border with the Arctic? Anyone know? Russia. George Friedman, the founder and CEO of Stratfor. Stratfor is a private CIA. Corporations essentially turn to Stratfor for intelligence information. So George Friedman, founder and CEO of Stratfor, recently made a speech in Chicago that I watched in full on YouTube. And he talked about the fact that the U.S. wants regime change in Moscow. The U.S. wants military bases in Ukraine. The U.S. wants to balkanize Russia, break it up into small pieces so that the oil corporations would have an easier time extracting the resources, both that lie on the land within the Russian Federation and also from the Arctic Ocean. GMO companies want the rich farmland in eastern Ukraine. They say it's the richest soil in all of Europe. And as you know, many European countries, most European countries, have rejected GMOs, saying we won't allow it. So they're not going to allow GMO farming. So if these agricultural corporations can grab Ukraine, big prize. To illustrate this, I want to share with you just a few words from U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piot, U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, on July 1st, just this month, speaking at the Fairmont Hotel in Kiev, saying, "I'm looking forward to going back to Odessa this week." He went on to say, "I'm delighted to be joined by Andy Hunter, the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. Andy and I will use the opportunity to highlight in a private, public way the support of the American business community here. And certainly you have a very large American business footprint already in Odessa and southern Ukraine. But it's also one of the areas where there's the greatest headroom. Because whether it's Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland, all of the food processing guys, everyone who's involved with agriculture, they'd like to be doing more here. And they're not doing more here because of the prohibitive investment climate." This is our ambassador who's greasing the skids for U.S. corporate domination of Ukraine. Fracking companies have already been doing testing in eastern Ukraine along the Russian border. And the U.S. is now bringing Muslim jihadists into Ukraine to fight alongside the Nazis against the people in eastern Ukraine. I placed an article on the table by the door by renowned, respected journalist Robert Perry, a longtime Associated Press reporter, broke the story on the Iran-Contra scandal years ago. He's just written a story on this U.S. bringing the jihadists in with the Nazis in Ukraine to kill the people in eastern Ukraine. Sadly, people who speak out against this U.S.-NATO war are Putinized, as I call it, here in the United States and in Europe, in a recycled version of 1950s red baiting. The Russians did not bring this on. In the case of Crimea, the citizens of Crimea were attacked immediately after Maidan by the Nazis. They were going for that prize next, because Crimea is where Russia had an agreement with the Ukrainian government to base its naval forces. They had an agreement that allowed for 25,000 Russian soldiers to be based on Crimea. And so immediately the U.S. wanted to grab Crimea next after the coup. But what happened was the people defended themselves in Crimea, and then the Russians sent in the famous Little Green Men, who came in to stabilize the situation. Not one person was killed, not one shot was fired, as the Russians helped stabilize the situation in Crimea. The people of Crimea then held an election, a referendum. 95.9% of the people of Crimea that voted in favor to rejoin Russia. And today, the United States is saying that Russia stole Crimea. The people of Crimea don't feel that way. If Russia or China set up bases, military bases, and were arming terrorists along the Canadian or Mexican border, the United States would go ballistic. But when the U.S. does it to Russia, they're accused of being, Russians are accused of being provocative and wanting to recreate the former Soviet empire because they react. You're on our border. Actually, the Ukrainian government has shelled inside of Russia. during this period when they're shelling eastern Ukraine. The Stockholm International Peace Institute tracks global military spending every year. In 2014, they said that the United States spends 34% of the world total of military spending. When you add in the NATO allies' share of that, it comes to 50%. Russia, in 2014, spent 4.8% of the world total. So there's no way, in my mind, that Russia is an aggressive military threat to the U.S. or NATO or Europe or to anyone else, not when they're spending 4.8% and U.S. and NATO combined are just over 50%. In fact, Russia has been instrumental in helping to get Syria to get rid of their chemical weapons and to very recently help negotiate the Iran nuclear deal and much more. It's difficult for Americans to admit that our country has become the new global military aggressor on behalf of corporate globalization, but it's a fact. As the old line goes, you can argue with me, make your case, but you can't argue with the facts. And I think the facts say it's the United States that is creating this turmoil that could literally lead to World War III inside of Ukraine. Thank you.
But word is coming out again about what's the whole story that we can figure out on that.
There was a Malaysia, I believe it was a Malaysian airliner that was shot down, and immediately the Western media claimed that it had been the rebels that shot it down, or possibly the Russians. Okay. Immediately, stories emerged that there was a man working inside of a airport control tower that was tracking fighter planes that were alongside that airliner, and he believed they were Ukrainian government fighter planes. And so there's always been disagreement about what really happened. The voice recorders and other evidence was taken immediately and transported to London. And then we were promised that there would be a report within a couple of weeks or months. And now it's been a year, right? I believe just a year now, and nothing has officially come out. Russia has done their own investigation and has said that clearly it wasn't the rebels nor the Russian government that shot it down. We know that because of U.S. satellite technology, U.S. supremacy with being able to see everything on the planet with its reconnaissance satellites, that the United States must know what really happened on that occasion. And the United States has never offered any of this information to the world so that they might know. And in fact, the Malaysians really don't have a clue what happened at all. So it's really, I don't know that we're ever going to really know officially, because the evidence, the voice recorders and other such evidence, is being held on to by the allies of this whole coup d'etat. I mean, Britain was heavily involved in the middle of this whole thing, along with the United States, and they are helping to, they're the ones that are supposed to be investigating this. So I don't know that we'll ever get a true answer.
Strange silence about the whole thing.
In the last, really, it's been like the last week to 2 weeks at the most, the Nazi right sector, these Nazi battalions, they have been in gunfights with Poroshenko government, the U.S. puppet government, saying that they want, as you said, Poroshenko to leave government immediately. And if he doesn't, they're going to have a second Maidan. and that they want to be in charge of the government. They want to take over the government, the Nazis. And so now there's this essentially war within the war going on. The Nazis are feeling, I believe what's going on is they're feeling so strong, so well-equipped, so well-trained, so arrogant, so supported. You might know that during the Maidan, when they were having their big rallies in the square there in Kiev, trying to topple the Yanukovych government, it wasn't just Victoria Nuland that was there with them, handing out cookies and bread to them with her little bag, but John McCain was up on the stage with the leaders of these Nazi battalions. And so they feel very supported by the American government and by especially by the right wing of the American government. And they feel very emboldened. So yes, they're making a play now to take over the country themselves. And so the real question is, what's going to happen? And as you said, the Nazis are saying that the Minsk II agreements that called for the ceasefire, which has been continually violated by the Ukrainian government, that daily continues shelling in violation of the ceasefire. The Nazis are saying, we don't want this ceasefire, we just want full-scale war. And so this is what's playing out, this drama today inside of Ukraine.
And the reason you're saying that is in Massachusetts, for example, we're building 4 new jails, but they're not jails, they're concentration camps. And what's happening around the world is climate change is getting worse, and there's a lot of this connected. How much oil is left on Earth? Well, the NASA report said if we don't do it in 2 years, put a head up and ask in 10. So if there's no farm, no food in the supermarket shelves, what's the U.S. government going to do? And what's the world going to do? There's no more food in California, you can't grow crops anymore soon. So there's a lot of things connected. What's going on in Ukraine is connected to this because it's all about the global war. Global oil. Whose oil is it? And with the oil running out, instead of Wall Street saying, let's go and look into solar power, wind power, the rest of the world's doing that, Germany's doing it, they're looking into alternative energies, we're not so much. We're still focusing on oil and coal. And with oil running out, we're going to other places outside to get more of it. Obama opened up oil in Alaska. Everybody says he's a Democrat. He's opened up the U.S. on the ocean. So my question for you guys, though, is since we know what it's really all about, it's about a couple of things connected, it's all connected. With Obama leaving the presidency soon, Wall Street owns him. He works for Wall Street. Who do you think their likely next candidate to be who will affect Ukraine? Which is their best candidate for Ukraine?
Have to stop these 24/7 assembly lines that are going all the time. And they're going right over here as we've talked. They're going down in Berwick. And they're going all over the country. And they're making the fighter jets, the drones, the planes, the rockets, they're making the nuts and the bolts. They're going while we're having coffee in the morning. They're going while we're sleeping at night. And I really believe that until we stop these 24/7 assembly lines, which we all know the people in Congress have no motivation to stop because I believe they're getting bribes from these weapons manufacturers that are making things, that we're going to keep having wars, we're going to keep having fighting, and we're walking like sleepwalkers to World War III because these companies are continuing to make the weapons of World War III or any war.
I want to kind of wrap things up by reading to you. I was at a conference in New Jersey a couple months ago, and there was several people from Ukraine there, and we were in a workshop together. And one of them is from Odessa. And if you look at the map, Odessa is down in touching the Black Sea here in southern Ukraine. And I asked this person to send me a page or two about the latest in Odessa that I could read tonight. So I want to read it to you all. This person writes, and this person asked that I not give their name because, well, you'll probably understand as I read it. Odessa region of Ukraine is extremely important for the Kiev authorities. Several lucrative ports with the flow of goods in transit, a strategically advantageous position in the area of the Danube mouth, the economically active population, the infrastructure which is not fully destroyed during the years of independence since the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is not a complete list of the region's benefits. Known to everybody, Odessa tolerance and multiculturalism became an obstacle to the total Ukrainization of the region. Odessa resisted the Maidan nationalism so strongly that the so-called patriots have developed and implemented a bloody campaign of intimidation on May 2nd, 2014, at the Odessa Trades Hall massacre, where more than 50 people were killed by neo-Nazis. Having survived the shock, the city and the region have moved to active resistance to the new order, expressed in constant actions of resistance, which has reached its climax in the period of May 2nd through 9th of 2015. In these days, tens of thousands of people came out into the streets of the city under the newly prohibited red flags, and Poroshenko showed the world a million of fake smiles on the Walk of Fame in Odessa under a thunderous cry, "Fascism will not pass." Under these conditions, Poroshenko recovered the move which is traditional to Ukrainian presidents. He appointed his godfather as the governor of the troublemaking Odessa region. But this time the choice was approved, even by the international curators of the Maidan power, for it was Mikhail Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia and a favorite U.S. CIA operative who is now wanted for crimes in Georgia, but Ukraine refuses to send him back to his country. He was appointed the governor of Odessa, and who is one of the most rabid Russophobes of our days, and in the same time doesn't have the reputation of Bandera nationalist, who is not directly related to the May 2nd mayhem. By all accounts, the Kiev government has assigned for Saakashvili two tasks, an obvious one and quite probable one. As to the first, everyone agrees that Poroshenko demanded to capture and redirect the financial flows, and above all, the proceeds from the customs and trading port, as well as pave the way for the privatization of the region's largest asset, portside plant. As to the probable objective, many analysts mention an escalation of tensions on the border with Transnistria. It's hard to say. Transnistria. It's along the border of Ukraine and Moldova, and it has a slew of Russian-speaking people there, and they're now being attacked as well by the whole U.S. CIA operation. With this, Saakashvili should cause the greatest possible damage to Russia, and the rest we'll see. So another front for the war, if you will. Not only then along the Russian border over here, but also along the Moldovan border here. A two-pronged front in this U.S.-CIA war inside of Ukraine. The new governor immediately developed a rigorous activity, strengthening his already robust reputation of a populist and a windbag. An objective observer analyzing the situation cannot ignore the following facts. Firstly, the active process of the property redistribution is at full speed in Odessa and its region. The press has already published numerous stories about the people in camouflage uniforms who appeared on various enterprises, captured them, and did not let the owners in. Usually these people present themselves as Pravi Sector, the right sector, Auto Maidan, another one of the fascist groups, and other Bandera nationalist brands. The great thing is they really are those. Creating and pumping the atmosphere of fear and terror, The nationalists literally beat political opponents with impunity and pay no attention to any laws of the country or to the statements of the liberal leaders of the region. Only recently, the militants brutally beat unarmed protesters who were protesting against holding in prison Artyom Buzilov, a progressive journalist. They repeatedly destroyed the humble and touching makeshift memorial erected by Odessans on the Kulakovo field in memory of those unarmed citizens who were killed at the Trades Hall on May 2nd. They also constantly terrorized the participants of weekly meetings on the field, many of whom are elderly people. The peak of cynicism of nationalist gangs is the bullying of mothers who lost their children on May 2nd at the Odessa Trade Hall. On July 13th of this month, the hearing on the case of Sergei Hodyaka in Odessa court was appointed. This Euromaidan activist is accused of the murder of one man, as well as attempted murder of several other people. The relatives of the victims, their friends, and Odessans who wanted to support the mothers and whose sons were apparently killed by this man during the May tragedy last year came to the court hearing. What happened later in the hall cannot be named other than coven and lawlessness. Relatives of the victims were insulted, pushed out from the benches. Despite all of the appeals to the judge and to the prosecutor, they were taken photos on mobile phones and cameras and were threatened to be burned next time. No action on the part of the judges and prosecutors to protect the relatives of the victims were taken. After the abolition of the court session, as the judges recused themselves, the patriots have built a corridor of shame through which all of the mothers of the victims and all of those who came to support them had to pass through. At the same time, they were abused, pushed, beaten, kicked in the legs, and spit upon. The police who could stop this abuse were absent in the courtroom. Looking at all these manifestations of painful social schizophrenia that is now not suppressed by the authorities, Odessans cannot believe in the good intentions of the new governor, Saakashvili. Changing the signs does not change anything in substance. That is the main conclusion of Odessa citizens. Moreover, a growing concern has the steps of the new governor that can only be described as a rejection of sovereignty. How else can we assess the fact of the regional administration officials being paid their salaries by the U.S. government, or the upcoming transfer the control of the South Odessa Customs Office to an American corporation? There has been at least one article speculating that the U.S. wants to use Odessa to port U.S. Navy warships deployed in the Black Sea. And only the nationalists and their henchmen do not get tired to extol the steps of the new governor. This causes vague doubts among ordinary Odessa citizens. The patriots of what state are those homegrown radical nationalists been taken? I just want to leave you with this. For a long time, I've wondered if the U.S. would kill the people in Nicaragua, people in El Salvador, people in Guatemala, people in Honduras, people in Afghanistan, people in Iraq, people in Libya, people in Syria, people in Ukraine who stand against corporate control. And you know, fascism by Mussolini was defined as the wedding of government and corporations. And that's what we have today. So if the U.S. would kill all these people all around the world when they stood up against this fascism, what makes us think that we're so special, that someday they won't come for us too? Thank you all very much for coming tonight.